Respected speaker for today's lecture, Professor Neera Chandhoke, dear members of the faculty, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. I'm extremely delighted that the Association of Political Science has managed to organize the Dr. Chandran D.S. Devanasen Endowment Lecture for the academic year 2020-21, and I'm grateful to the Lord God for the same. I deem it an honor to welcome Professor Neera Chandhoke, a person of eminence and a speaker for today's lecture, to our midst. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us. We look forward to listening to your lecture on Gandhi's critique of violence. On behalf of the association, I would also like to welcome our professors and fellow students who are here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti. Moving on, I now request Dr. S.P. Christopher Chandran, President of the Association of Political Science, to address the gathering. Sir.
Thank you, Shruti, for doing the welcome. I was also asked to do the welcome. Okay. Anyway, Professor Neera Chandhoke, my dear students and colleagues of our department. Good morning to one and all. It is my duty to welcome each one of you to the Endowment Lecture. Pandemic has definitely put people inside homes. There has been a slowdown in economic growth and many adverse things have happened. But in the field of academics, pandemic has opened out avenues and opportunities that in normal times we would not have even dreamt of. Financially, it would have remained a distant dream for all of us to have in our midst a renowned academician like Professor Neera Chandhoke. Thanks to technology like Google Classrooms or Zoom and other platforms that have made our distant dream a reality. Thank you very much, madam. As the head of the department, it is my pleasure to thank you for accepting our invitation. Professor Chandhoke speaking to us today is significant when she delivers Dr. Chandran Devanasen Endowment Lecture, as Dr. Devanasen's PhD thesis in Harvard University is Making of the Mahatma. And hence, when she delivers this lecture on Gandhi, it makes it very apt and special to each one of us. Once again, with a special word of welcome to Dr. Chandhoke, I would like every one of you to listen to this rare privilege of listening to a lecture and be benefited. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Now I invite Amrit from First MA to kindly share a few words about Dr. Devanasen.
Hello, my name is Amrit. I'm from the first PG MA, here to do introduction to Dr. Chandra D.S. Devanasen. A new era had dawned in 1962 when Dr. Chandran D.S. Devanasen took over as the first Indian principal of Madras Christian College. It is rare even now to find a person who has studied at the two coveted educational institutions in the world. Dr. Chandra Devanasen was educated at Cambridge and then secured a Harvard doctorate. Imbued with the Gandhian vision, Devanasen transformed the college into a reputed educational community. Several buildings and projects such as the zoology department or the building and the women's lounge, the farm, the guest house, McAfee's art gallery, and continuing on to the faculty residence tell the great success story of Devanasen decade, which was from 1962 to 1972. Later, at the personal invitation of the former Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Dr. Devanasen left our college to start the Northeast Hill University. It was only through Dr. Devanasen's vision we expanded the academic horizon of our college, involving the neighborhood communities in the educational process. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrit. I now call upon Ruchita to introduce the speaker of the day.
Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Professor Neera Chandhoke. Neera Chandhoke is currently a National Fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research and a Distinguished Fellow at the Center of Equity Studies, New Delhi. Prior to this, she worked as a professor of political science at the University of Delhi and the director of Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi. Her main teaching and research interests include political theory, comparative politics, and the politics of developing society with special focus on India. Professor Chandhoke has authored The Conceits of Civil Society, Beyond Secularism, The Rights of Religious Minorities, and State and Civil Society Exploration in Political Theory. She has also edited Mapping Histories, Grassroots Politics and Social Transformation, and Understanding the Post-Colonial World. Professor Chandhoke regularly contributes articles to national and international journals and to the Indian newspaper on the contemporary theme. We are deeply honored by your presence, ma'am. We look forward to today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchita. Now is the moment we have been waiting for. Let us welcome Professor Neera Chandhoke. Thank you. Ma'am.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this very prestigious lecture in the memory of Professor Devanasen. I had no idea he was such a big institution builder, responsible for making the Madras Christian College into the institution of eminence that it is, and of course founding the Shillong University. It's also a pleasure to speak to anybody in Madras, because what used to be Madras in my days, because my last 3 years of schooling were at Good Shepherd's Convent in Madras. And Nongambakam used to be a little sleepy part of Chennai, but now it's such a bustling metropolis. So I'd always probably thought that after school I'll join MCC, your college, but then I happened to come to Delhi. My father was transferred and I've been in Delhi since then, but I have very fond memories of Madras. What I want to do today is to actually contemporize Gandhi. The problem with much of the current work on Gandhi is threefold. The first attempt to memorialize Gandhi is to read him exegetically, read him paragraph by paragraph. This is what he said, this is what he said when, and why did he say this, and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of that work has already been accomplished. We don't need to, Gandhi wrote a lot, and he very often wrote things that were at odds with themselves. But that kind of fossilizes him, that puts him squarely in the early 20th century, when he was responding a great deal to events, and it doesn't help us understand how Gandhi can aid us in negotiating the impossibilities of the human condition in India today and in the world in general. The outbreak of violence, we are all very familiar with Black Lives Matter in the United States. We are all very familiar with the eruption of violence in various parts of India. And in a way, how does Gandhi help us to understand our contemporary condition? The second way in which Gandhi is being appropriated, I'm afraid, by sections of a very conservative right-wing opinion, is to see him as a philosopher of Hinduism. Now, Gandhi was no philosopher of Hinduism. I don't think Gandhi ever went to a temple in his life. He was somebody who used the resources of Hinduism, but he made it very clear that my reading of religion is eclectic. He had much to learn from Jainism, which was, of course, his mother's religion, but also from Christianity. The more I read Gandhi, the more I realize that Gandhi was basically influenced by Catholicism, and you see his focus on public confessions in a way, or his insistence on the primacy of ethics. And the third way in which Gandhi is treated is to make him irrelevant to the political condition, see him as, for example, the symbol of Swachh Bharat. He's been reduced to a pair of spectacles, and as somebody said, he's being treated like a sanitary inspector. Whereas Gandhi was particularly subversive. That man did more to undermine the moral foundations of the British Raj than any other leader. And I'm saying this very consciously, very, very conscious also of the fact that he's very controversial among the Dalit community, among women, and it is true. But we should not read Gandhi as a Mahatma. We have to reinvent Gandhi as a political philosopher. We have to reinvent Gandhi as someone who can help us negotiate the ambiguities of our condition today and try and understand what is wrong with violence. Now, Gandhi's ruminations on violence occur in a very specific context, the outbreak of major what Sumit Sarkar has called revolutionary terrorism in major parts of India. And this followed the partition of Bengal in 1905. It had started earlier, and I'll just come to that. And the peculiar condition in which Gandhi wrote his Hind Swaraj, and the other day, you'd have to think about what is it that Swaraj means. I don't think anybody had been able to give us a satisfactory answer. In many hands, Swaraj lands up looking like the positive liberty of Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah Berlin saw positive liberty as a very totalitarian concept. What does it mean to say subordinate your lower self to your higher self? A democratic state doesn't tell its people how to believe, what to believe, how to act. The democratic state provides the preconditions for human flourishing, for people to follow their projects, or as Rawls said, to people to follow and revise their projects. Maybe we get an inkling of what Swaraj meant when we think about Gandhi's reflections on violence. Let me begin by recounting a murder. I happen to be very fond of detective fiction, so I'm very, very happy to actually start this talk by reference to this murder. At a meeting of the Indian National Association held at the Imperial Institute of London on the 1st of July 1909, a murder was committed. The assassin was a young Indian student called Madan Lal Dhingra. And the victim was a political aide-de-camp to the Secretary of State for India, that was Morley. The name of the aide-de-camp was Sir Curzon Wiley. Now, Dhingra hailed from a very propertied and a very influential family in Amritsar in Punjab. And it was a family that was extremely friendly with the British authorities. And Dhingra was a very mediocre, very nondescript student. And his father had sent him to England to pursue a course in higher studies, which he did. He started studying engineering, and he was on his way back to India when he came in touch with the young radicals at India House in London. Now, at that time, India House radicals were led by V.D. Savarkar, who at that point of time, he renounced it later, but at that point of time advocated the cult of violence and to glorify violence. He was supposed to be such a mesmerizing speaker, such a wonderful mobilizer, that actually dozens of Indian students, and you can find hardly any leader of the nationalist movement who had not been a part of the India House. Most of them studied abroad in higher universities and in institutes of higher learning. And they'd all become a part of India, whether it was Lajpat Rai, whether it was, you name them, they were there, Shyamji Krishna Verma, who set up the India House. But it was a group which was known for its complete radicalism. In 1909, the anti-British campaign, and remember, this was the time when India was up in flames after the partition of Bengal. The anti-British campaign reached its peak in India House. On 10th May 1909, it culminated in the honoring of Indian martyrs of the 1857 revolt. The emotion-laden and the very vengeful tone of the speakers seemed to have impacted Dhingra, who was completely apolitical till then, confused young man, he didn't know where politics were. But that kind of charged patriotism in which they talked about the way the British government had treated Indians in the wake of the revolt of 1857 impacted a young man to a degree that he took a life. the British judiciary sentenced him to death. Now, news of the assassination when he killed Lord Curzon Wiley had reached Gandhi, who was on his way to England, to London, from South Africa. That was the time when Gandhi was still in South Africa. And he had taken a delegation, he was heading a delegation of Indians to talk to the British government about the way Indians were generally treated in South Africa, particularly Transvaal, South Africa. Now, Gandhi was acquainted with Curzon Wiley, the man who died, but his reaction to the murder outstripped his personal grief at the death of an acquaintance. Violence, he had come to believe at that part of his life, after his experiments with non-violent struggle Satyagraha in South Africa, was not only futile, it was corrupt, it was corrupting, it was absolutely counterproductive. Nothing good came out of violence, nothing ever could. This deep conviction, which shaped his strategy against the very, very racist colonial regime of South Africa, was to become a part of Indian politics about 10 years later when Gandhi returns to India. But at that point, when he heard about Dhingra killing Curzon Wiley, he was astonished, because in any case, he was very, very taken aback because whenever he was in London, he made it a point to associate with the young India House radicals. And their advocacy of violence, their enthusiastic support of violence, kill as many Britishers as you want to, dismayed him. This was a completely one-side dedication to violence. And at a meeting to honor Dhingra, V.D. Savarkar read out a letter which had been ostensibly written by Dhingra, but a number of historians had said that actually Savarkar had written the letter. Savarkar said that Dhingra, according to Dhingra, and I quote, "The only lesson required for India at present is to learn how to die. And the only way to teach it is by dying ourselves. Therefore I die, glorying in my martyrdom," close quotes. And Gandhi despaired. And this despair inspired him to write Hind Swaraj. Now, as everybody knows, Hind Swaraj was written on board the ship which carried Gandhi back from London to the Transvaal in 1909. He wrote it with a pencil. And he said, "This was my answer to the Indian school of violence and its prototype in South Africa." And Gandhi says, "I came in contact with every known Indian anarchist in London. Their bravery impressed me, but I feel their zeal was misguided. I felt that violence was no remedy for India's ills, and that her civilization required the use of a higher weapon for their self-protection." Now, close quotes. Now, 1909 is a time when the moderate section in the Congress party had been challenged by the extremists, by Tilak, by Lajpat Rai, by B.C. Pal, and the Congress split in 1906 on the issue. It was also the first time in 1906 that Dadabhai Naoroji, then 96 years old, took over the presidency of the Congress in Calcutta. And Dadabhai Naoroji spoke about the ultimate objective of nationalist agitation to be Swaraj. Now, Swaraj, as used by Dadabhai Naoroji, signified autonomy within the British Empire. So on one hand, you had the politics of mendicancy, the politics of giving petitions, the politics of begging the British government to give Indians a certain degree of autonomy. On the other hand, you had the outburst of violent terrorism, revolutionary terrorism, and this starts actually in 1870. It starts as a response to the British policy of reprisals against Indian, what was called mutineers. We don't call them mutineers any longer. We call them first revolt. It was not a revolution. It was a very upper class revolt, feudal kind of a revolt. But in a way, India was awash with the commitment to, so one hand, the politics of constitutionalism, on the other hand, the politics of violence, and Gandhi gives you a third way. He makes three arguments for nonviolence, and I will summarize them in the next 15, 20 minutes that I have. But you have to understand that Gandhi is looking for a third way because he's very, very conscious that moderation or this dedication to violence is not going to get independence for India. The three ways in which he countered violence or negated violence and advocated nonviolence are, first, the whole denunciation of the idea that violence is political spectacle. It is just theater. The second argument is based upon knowledge, nonviolence as a part of your epistemology, and I'll just come to that in 5 minutes. And the third one is, what is the nature of our being? He was very conscious. He was in a context of deep despair at the way the British government had set out to humiliate Indians, launch a policy of reprisal against them, to hammer them into submission, and to deprive them of any vestige of self-respect. In his work on the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and Victorian trauma, because you have to understand that in England, many enlightened souls actually supported the policy of reprisals, the policy of revenge that the British were carrying out with regard to Indians. The author of this book, Indian Rebellion of 57 and Victorian Trauma, Christopher Herbert, writes of the sternly pious subsequent Brigadier General named Neil, who came to be known for the ferocious retribution that he had inflicted upon mutineers and their suspected sympathizers. He commanded Kanpur, and Kanpur was one of the centers of the 1857 revolt. Sepoys who had taken part in the mutiny, and most of them were upper class, while walking to their execution, they were blown out of cannons. I mean, they were not only hanged, they were blown out of cannons. Before being taken to the gallows, each sepoy was forced to lick a piece of the floor where ostensibly British blood had been spilt. So this was an act of appalling pollution for an upper caste Hindu. I mean, you just don't lick blood. That is a part of your pollution purity ritual, your philosophy, good or bad as it may be. And this is what he did to the Indian sepoys, and much worse was done to them. I mean, if you go to Lahore, for instance, then the cannon is still there, out of which the Indian boys were ejected along with the cannonball. Now, during 1870s, resentment built up against the arrogance of the British and the utter contempt with which it treated Indians, educated middle class, and economic exploitation. And you should remember that was the time when Dadabhai Naoroji started writing these series of articles that became Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, in which he talked about the drain of wealth from India to England. You know, 50 years later, Frantz Fanon, in the context of Algeria, points out that the colonial project is stamped with the cloven hoof of violence. This generates all kinds of pathologies. When the state is violent, violence becomes a part of the body politic. Born out of a systematic negation of the worth of another human being. You see, when you become violent towards another human being, you no longer regard them as a human being. You regard them as a thing, as something who you should inflict violence upon. Colonialism constantly forces the colonized to ask the question, who am I? You see, this question of identity, who am I? I'm being treated by the colonial government as a nobody, as somebody who doesn't count, somebody who has to be repressed, somebody has to be humiliated. And you see, when you humiliate somebody, you take away their self-respect. And when you lose self-respect, you lose your identity. Now, it was in this context that violence against the colonial power became a common cause. And many advocates, and you see, Indian nationalists went to Ireland, they went to Russia, where they studied anarchism. They visited all the centers of violence in the world to learn the techniques of revolutionary violence. And they felt that violence will give us back our self-respect. Now, brought up among chilling tales of colonial brutality after 1857, educated and often unemployed Indian youth were convinced that dishonor could be wiped out and a sense of self be restored to the body politic and to the individual. If you look at Maharashtra, where Bal Gangadhar Tilak was to focus on the restoration of selfhood of the Hindu, and of course with attendant implications for communalism, you find that all these young men were saying, we have to kill. And they took up the Bhagavad Gita and they said, the Gita says, do your duty. Our duty is to kill the white man. On the day of his execution, and you get a sense of what violence is, when you read Dhingra's letter, which he had written on the day of his execution, that was 17th August 1909, he was executed by the British government. He said, I attempted to shed English blood as a humble revenge for the inhuman hangings and deportations of patriotic Indian youth. In this attempt, I have consulted nobody but my own conscience. Poor in wealth and intellect, a son like myself has nothing to offer his mother except his blood. And we have to die. And they found a picture postcard of a painter and a portrait of Lord Curzon, who had partitioned Bengal and he had written Heathen Dog. Now, a number of organizations sprang up in India to counter violence, Punjab, Maharashtra, Bengal. And this, of course, this exploded when the partition of Bengal was happened. The trajectory of violence was introduced in June 1897 in Maharashtra when two brothers, Damodar Hari Chapekar and Balkrishna Hari Chapekar, shot dead the plague commissioner of Pune. This was a great plague that struck India in the latter part of the 19th century. The plague commissioner was W.C. Rand, and his officer was Lieutenant Charles Ayers. Now, what the British officers were doing were walking into the domestic part of houses to check whether the onslaught of plague. And according to that, the ethos of either Hindus or Muslims, they don't walk into the women's quarters. In return, both the brothers shot them dead and they were sentenced to prison. Now, Chapekar, the elder brother, writes, you fools, what is the point of your muscles? Flex your muscles, kill people, and a one-sided attempt. Now, you have to understand that this restoration of self-respect is very closely identified with restoration of manhood, with the act of picking up a gun and aiming it at the colonial power. Now, she says, the British Queen, there's a plague in India, and the British Queen is celebrating her centenary, and we should be using violence. Whether it was Bal Gangadhar Tilak or Aurobindo Ghosh initially or B.C. Pal, violence was advocated as the only out of the humiliation that Indians had been caught into. It was in the shadow of this particular dedication to violence that Gandhi was to argue against violence. He begins his Hind Swaraj by unsparingly condemning the culture of violence inspired by what he called misguided patriots like Dhingra. And when the interlocutor asks him, cannot we free India by killing a few British? He says, do you not shudder at the idea of spilling blood? I mean, this is the opening sentence of Hind Swaraj. For the first thing, Gandhi felt violence was not productive. It was not good political strategy. And this is something, you know, anybody who resorts to violence to pursue political aims should understand. The violence of colonialism, it is very likely with precipitate violence as reaction. But history shows up, the second category does not work. It does not work, particularly in colonial situations. Even if India could be freed, at the cost of torn feet and blooded hands, Gandhi seemed to say, her people would never come into their own. You know, there is a selfhood which is involved here, that to assume that your selfhood is restored if you pick up a gun and shoot another man is to actually forget that you can't use violence as a means. You don't use violence, violence uses you. You become enthralled, you become caught up in the web of violence, you become ensnared in its coils. When violence becomes the architect of history, it can only replace oppression with oppression. Now, if a nationalist movement is based upon violence and these people come to power, Gandhi asked, what kind of politics are they going to give us? Somebody who's brought up on a conviction to violence is not going to make a very interesting post-colonial elite. They're not going to be, they're not going to understand how to govern their country except with violence. And he says, and I quote, those who will rise to power of murder will not make the nation happy. Those who believe that India has gained by Dhingra's Act and other similar acts in India make a serious mistake. Dhingra was a patriot, but his love was blind. He gave his body in the wrong way. The ultimate result can only be mischievous. This is the first, in the first section, Gandhi's negation of violence is that if you're going to use violence to get independence, violence is not going to lose hold of you. You're going to be imbricated. You're going to be embedded in violence. The power of violence over human beings cannot be underrated. It's not a weapon which can be picked up and discarded at will. When the colonial finger writes the alphabet of blood, or when the nationalist finger writes the alphabet of blood, the blood doesn't wash away. If you remember Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth, the murder of Duncan left stigmata on her hands. She would wash her hands at night and say, where this blood never go away. This Gandhi recognized. He recognized that we must understand we understand the attraction that violence holds for a people who have been held in bondage, but we also understand that violence will capture us. Violence is like a quagmire. It sucks people into its depth. From here, there is no escape. When violence holds people in thrall, disintegration follows. We can't control violence. Violence controls us. And then he goes on to say, in my view, Dhingra was innocent. The murder was committed in a moment of intoxication. It is not merely bhang or wine that can make you intoxicated. A mad idea can also make you intoxicated. And this was the case with Dhingra. Now, his larger point was that when an anti-colonial struggle, when a nationalist movement is going to use violent means, nothing will change when they come into power. Nothing can change. Because, and this is very interesting because this is very much a part of Marxist theory. When leaders perform violence, or when people like Dhingra or Chapekar perform violence, violence becomes theater. They're not mobilizing the masses. The masses are an audience. Violence is spectacle. Whereas Gandhi Satyagrahi must go out and mobilize people. This is very Marxist in its orientation. People must know what they're fighting for. They must know that they're fighting for democracy. They must know they're fighting for freedom. They must know what they're fighting against. Now, when they are sitting supine and passive, and violence is being unleashed by a few angry young men or women, you have violence as theater, you have violence as spectacle. spectacle. It's a kind of spectacle the ancient Romans used to launch upon their audiences. Gandhi Satyagraha, if you read his Satyagraha, his work on Satyagraha, you know, a Gandhi Satyagrahi had to prepare for 40 days before he undertook Satyagraha. He used to fast, he used to sleep on the ground, and he used to eschew all negative thoughts from his head. And more importantly, he would go out and mobilize people and tell them why Satyagraha was being practiced, on what grounds they were resisting. And the Satyagrahi has to know that if he breaks the law, he has to be punished. They must be prepared for prison and for torture. You see, in order to lead a people into independence, in order to awaken a people into the possibilities of freedom, leaders have to mobilize them, but this mobilization doesn't happen if some spectacle of violence is going to hold the audience in thrall. It'll be something to watch, but you will not know why people are committing violence. Now, in a way, he said, and Raghavan Iyer says, for Gandhi, a freedom fighter must focus on the awakening of the slumbering conscience of a large number of people. It's not that people don't know, but people are so caught up in their everyday life that they don't know what colonialism is about, don't know what nationalism is about. And they don't even know what the future holds for them. And in a way, when you say that this is what we are fighting against, we are using non-violent means, and this is going to be the shape of our polity, that is Swaraj. Gandhi is telling the violent revolutionary, my non-violent Satyagrahi is morally superior to you because he will face the bayonets of the police without cringing, without being scared. The second reason why Gandhi eschewed violence and adopted non-violence has to do with knowledge, and this is epistemological. Now, very few of us know that Gandhi read widely when he was in prison. We know he read widely, but we do not know what he read. You know, Gandhi translated, I beg your pardon, Plato's Apology, which deals with the trial of Socrates, into Gujarati. He read Plato. Now, the Plato's Apology deals with the trial of Socrates. We all know about Socrates, the philosopher in ancient Greece. And the wise men of Athens sitting at the trial tribunal asked Socrates, and this is in the play, the Apology, why do you stop your people and talk to them on the road? Now the people they stopped and talked on the road to were all property, natural born Athenians, because in ancient Athens, only a property, natural born Athenian could be a citizen. Aliens, women, slaves, they were not citizens. He would ask them why, and he would talk to them. So he said why they thought he was evoking sedition, treason. Why was he talking to people? And Socrates said, very interesting, you have to understand the philosophical implications of what Socrates he says. He, my friend, Chaerephon, went to the... I'm sorry, can you hear me? Can I come closer?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you, ma'am.
Okay, he said, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Okay. So he says, my friend Chaerephon went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the oracle, she would tell the future, who is the wisest man in Athens? And the oracle said, Socrates. Socrates says, I know I'm not the wisest man in Athens. So I started to prove the oracle wrong. So he started stopping. Dramatists, philosophers, poets, physicists, you know, Athens had them all. It was a very vibrant society. And asking them questions. The Socratic method is you ask questions and you expose a person's wisdom or a lack of knowledge through the question mode. By the end of it, Socrates says, I knew I was wiser than them. Why? At least I know I don't know. They don't even know they don't know. You must be conscious of the limits of your knowledge. A truly wise man doesn't get drunk with the power of knowledge. A truly wise man knows there is so much more to know. That was exactly Gandhi's argument. When he talks about religion giving you the truth, he says, but you don't know what the truth is. We can only be a seeker after the truth. It's like those 5 blind men feeling an elephant and each telling you a different part of the elephant and saying that's an elephant. Now, if you're a seeker after the truth, 2 implications follow. You can't be confident you know and only you know, everybody else is ignorant. Violence is born out of the belief, I know you are ignorant, my religion is better than yours, my caste is better than yours, my gender is better than yours, therefore I use violence on you. But if you're convinced you don't know, what is the second implication? You search for violence, you're a seeker, you search for the truth. Truth, I may tell you, is knowledge. There's a difference between information and knowledge. Information piles you with data and events and recounting. Knowledge tells you what to make of them. What are the patterns you discern in the past? What is what you see for the future? And according to Gandhi, this search for the truth has to be collective. We have to link up with each other. It doesn't matter what religion, what caste, gender we belong to. We have to collectively learn how to seek after the truth. Now, if you are aware if you are ignorant, you don't practice violence. Violence is born out of the arrogance that only I know the truth. Therefore, you have all these suicide bombers, or all these terrorists, or all these people who ritually kill people of another religion. Why do they kill them? They say, our religion is better than yours. Now you don't know whether your religion is better than theirs. How will you know unless you start talking to each other? That is why in divided societies like ours, many political theorists advocate the virtue of dialogue. Start talking to each other, start learning, and you will realize, I don't know the truth. I mean, I studied in a convent, and what I learned from my education, I learned the value of equality. And I was born a Hindu. It's not precisely a very equal religion. I learned the value of sharing, not charity, sharing. I learned the value of modesty. And I know we learn from Islam the importance of brotherhood. We learn from Sikhism how to help our fellow beings. You look at the farmers' demonstration going on outside Delhi, the value of solidarity, how you help each other. You know, in a way, every religion has to teach us. None of us know what is the truth. All our religions are flawed. They're not flawed, they're incomplete. Right? So instead of treating somebody like finished, I know everything and therefore I must be violent towards others. You know, I'm always stunned when I meet a very arrogant intellectual, because at least an intellectual should know that they don't know. Because Socrates taught you, you don't know. And this is precisely what Gandhi believed in his policy of ahimsa. The third argument, and this is the final argument, is what do I do when I hurt another person? What happens to me? Now, there are 2 kinds of knowledge systems which will tell you what happens to me. The Bible tells us, treat others as you would have them treat you. I mean, I misquote, but treat others the way you would have them treat you. And that is exactly what Immanuel Kant said when he said, treat others the way you want to be treated. Gandhi uses another argument. He respects this argument. He says, according to the Advait, the other is a part of me. So when I hurt the other, I hurt myself. Something in me is damaged when I practice violence. I lose my humanity. I lose my capacity to feel. I lose the sense of solidarity. I lose empathy. I lose the ability to feel pain. I become hardened. I become a diminished human being, because the other is not the other is a part of me. We are all parts of each other. And others represent us in a different form. And then he goes on to say, I do not believe that an individual may gain spiritually and when those who surround him suffer. I believe in the essential unity of man and, for that matter, of all lives. Therefore, I believe that if one man gains spirituality, everybody gains with him. And if one man falls, others fall. I want to make my concluding remarks now. For Gandhi, therefore, non-violence is a default principle. We do it for three reasons. One, on an ordinary day-to-day level, we don't harm others because you harm yourself. That is one. Secondly, you don't harm others because you do not know what you know. I mean, why are you harming people? Out of ignorance. Violence is born out of ignorance. It is not born out of knowledge. Because knowledge tells you the more you know, the more you need to know. And thirdly, if you want to fight a movement, if you want to fight a revolution, you cannot afford to be violent, because that would mean the post-colonial structure that comes up will be stamped with Satan, with the cloven hoof of violence. It is not as if individuals are naturally guided to non-violence. You know, when somebody hits you, your immediate reaction is to hit them back. When somebody hurts you by speech, you answer back. But they can be guided towards this end. They can be guided towards this end by a Satyagrahi who awakens people to the possibilities of the human condition. This is an accomplishment that revolutionary terrorists could not aim for and did not aim for because their advocacy of violence closed their minds. These are ignorant people. It denuded their psyche. Not only were their aims narrow and their commitment to violence unthinking, the revolutionary terrorists were strangely apolitical. They were apolitical because these random acts of violence would not spark off a national struggle for independence. Remember, you know, a historian, Ravindra Kumar, used to tell us that more people mobilized in the cause of freedom in India than in China, and Mao led a major struggle. Why were people mobilized? Not because a few people were committing violence, because Gandhi spoke to them. Nehru writes in his autobiography, he says, you know, I was sometimes a little puzzled, little unhappy with his fast because it evoked very emotional passions. But he had a strange way of touching the heart of people. When he spoke to them in simple language, you know, he spoke like the Buddha spoke. Buddha never took part, Gautam Buddha never took part in the very learned discourses of his day. He talked in parables, the way Christ talked. You talk in parables. You talk where a story has a lesson. You appeal to the hearts of humankind. This is not to say people don't understand intellectual conversations. It is to say you start off by the whole notion of a parable, the whole notion of simplicity, and the most complex task for a teacher is to translate difficult ideas into easy language so that students understand. I've always thought that is the gift of a teacher, to translate complex ideas into a simple language. You don't have to repeat the difficult words. I mean, these days nobody uses difficult words, but still, you don't use difficult words. What are you doing? You're evoking a passion in the hearts of the students for the subject you're teaching, that is political science. You are making political science not a discipline, but a vocation. Something your hearts are involved in, something your psyche is involved with. He argues, you know, he could mobilize for this reason. Gandhi could mobilize one of the most spectacular anti-colonial movements. That's why I said, let's reinvent him as a political philosopher, not as a Mahatma. Based on the union of ethics and politics that the revolutionary terrorists had sundered. In the process, he took care to educate, to politicize, to warn, to marshal energies, and in the end, to nudge people towards what is due to them, not only because they are Indian, but because they are human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the enlightening and insightful lecture. The floor is now open for questions.
Okay. Shall I provoke something? What did you think of Gandhi's notion that all of us are basically ignorant, no matter how much we know? Can someone reply? No? Yes, Shruti?
Yes, ma'am. So what I think about, I think there is a huge amount of truth in that. Considering how, no matter how much you know, like you said, the very root of violence is stems from the fact that people think, oh yeah, I know better, we know better, and we know what the ultimate truth is. So regardless of how much, and there is this general notion or this general belief that talks about how the more you know, the more you realize
Don't know.
how much more you need to know, yeah, or the more you realize how much you don't know, in fact. So there is a huge element of truth in what the statement that you just said, ma'am.
Yeah. You know, of course, Socrates never wrote anything. He's the protagonist of Plato's many works. But I thought Socrates actually understood the human condition very well. And this whole knowledge of what Bhikkhu Parekh called an epistemological lack, that we are assured that we don't know enough, is enough to make you modest. Now, this is the basis of the whole notion of dialogue. That, you see, nobody can arrive at the truth by themselves. I don't know, as a child or as a young girl, I read Ayn Rand. I'm sure a lot of people still read Ayn Rand. She was a libertarian. I mean, she was not a liberal, but she believed in this whole notion of individualism, a limited state market. Now, in her Fountainhead, you remember the architect Howard Rourke? I've always thought he was a very lonely individual. He could not reach out to other people. He could make no connections. He thought he's sitting atop a mountaintop, ruminating on what should be done next. This is the kind of architecture I want. It was a very sad story, because individuals are not the source of their values. Individuals learn only when they learn to engage with other human beings and get a different picture on what they hitherto have believed. I mean, how many of us came to feminism not because we stayed at home, but because we went out and met feminists, saw films, read books, saw theater, right? And understood that the problem is not men, the problem is the system, isn't it? I mean, so you see, unless you have a conversation, that is why I'm very happy I'm speaking to the Political Debating Society of Political Science, because debate and dialogue are essential for the human condition. By yourself, that is a modernist vanity. You yourself know. Only you yourself. You yourself, how can you know? You're not, you can only know through conversations. And once you enter a conversation, your ideas might change, at least they may be modified, and teaches you modesty. That's true.
I think that's very true. Also, considering how, so as long as you believe that you know everything, you are going to think that you're self-sufficient. But it is on the basis of your realization of how you are not self-sufficient, you cannot be self-reliant, that you forge connections with other human beings, and that is the very basis of a society. That is how a society functions. So I think that is what you just said is extremely relevant, ma'am. It makes so much sense. Thank you, ma'am. Anjana, I think we can move on in that case.
Ma'am, can I just
Ma'am, please go on, ma'am.
thank you so much, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture. And our students study Gandhi, and I think it will be very, very useful for them. Ma'am, I just want you to tell us a little more on the non-violent society envisaged by Gandhi, and what could be the challenges, or is it ever realizable? Just please tell us a little on that.
Okay. You know, I very seldom talk about myself, but I've just kind of last year completed a book called Violence in Our Bones. It's relevant to what Sudha Gopinath asked me. It is a survey of violence in India, from gender to caste to communalism, partition, Northeast, Kashmir, Maoism. And what astonished me is the amount of violence that goes into the making of social relations. How does a non-violent society come about? Now, I'm not denying that violence is it's not a sentiment that is unknown to people. Which of us have not thought, even for the fleeting moment, that I wish she or he were dead? I mean, this happens all the time. But between a wish and the intention to carry it out, there is a very big lag. And I think that lag is triggered off by political agents. The fact that we are a plural society is an empirical fact. We may not dine with each other, we may not intermarry, but it doesn't mean we go around killing each other. You see, or harming them or setting fire to their businesses. Between the empirical reality that we are a plural society and the fact of caste riot, gender violence, there is a whole array of triggers which sets off your unarticulated, inchoate mentalities into acts of violence. You know, I've often thought that actually the kind of, and I say this in wake of a very, very brutal murder that has taken place of a young woman in UP, in Uttar Pradesh. And why is it that after the fact of gang rape, these young women are being brutalized? I mean, it is something which we have to think about it. The fact that, and many of them, unfortunately, happen to belong to the so-called lower castes. Now, the fact that you see some, you know, you're brought up in a society where caste is important, doesn't mean you do all these horrendous things. I think between that and the act of violence, there is a whole range of triggers, and many of these triggers are amoral politicians, merchants of hate, people who specialize in triggering off your violent impulses. We look at the detective novel. There might be somebody who hates another person for many reasons, wealth or being better off or being more lucky in many other ways. X does not kill Y ritually. X kills Y only when a troublemaker stems off. And you know, there's this whole question of, you go back to Shakespeare's Macbeth. Macbeth probably wouldn't have killed Duncan unless his wife had goaded him to do so. Lady Macbeth. This is not an act of misogyny. This is an act of, actually, I think, ambition. Now, between being possessing, and all of us, I mean, I must confess, at times you say, oh my God, I wish so-and-so was dead. It'll make life so much simpler. And then you say, no, you know, having studied in a Catholic convent, it's bad. You can't have evil thought. But that thought has come to you, doesn't mean you go around killing people. I think there are too many merchants of hate in our society that concentrate on evoking resentments and feelings that are subterranean and causing riots, causing individual acts of dishonor, and even treating young girls, this child is only 14 years old, and it makes me shudder when I think of what has happened to her. It is in the papers today, Hathras again. This is Aligarh, not Hathras. What did they do to her? This happens when you have a crowd mentality, you know, when not only one person, but a crowd, 3, 4, 5 people are involved. And often the reports of such kind of inhuman atrocities on the bodies of young women or children, which is so, you can't even think about what kind of animals would do this. You know what triggers it off? They're watching bloody videos on their cameras. Videos of sadism. Because there was a case of a young woman being brutalized by 3 men in Bombay. And when they came to court, this is a mall that has become a factory that has become a mall. She started throwing up because she said these 3 men were watching videos while they were committing this ungovernable act of utmost humiliation on her and ordering her to do things. Now, what is the trigger? The trigger is a pornographic video. You see, I'm not saying ban things. That's not the point. The point is there is a trigger. Now you have to figure out what the trigger is. There is an ideology which can be trigger. There can be patriarchy. It can be casteism. But there are just too many merchants of hate in our society, and I just don't know how to get over this. We had thought 2012 when the Nirbhaya case happened and a number of laws were enacted, but maybe these laws have triggered off even further revengeful acts on the bodies of women. Violence is not so easily explainable, and I don't know what a non-violent society will look like. Perhaps you think and start talking to each other, because when you talk to others, you recognize them as an equal. You don't see them as somebody, like Gandhi said, you don't see them as somebody who has to be brutalized. So one way is, of course, a society that is truly dialogical, a society that can debate, that can talk instead of hitting each other. Can we sit down and talk about it? It might make a difference, but I must confess I haven't seen a non-violent society, not even Scandinavian countries. Because if you see the fiction coming out from Scandinavia or the films coming out from, they're full of terrible brutality, and you wonder what poverty or welfare have to do with this. This is a hidden but a sentiment that is part of your body, I think. But I'm sorry, I can't give you more. I think it would be completely utopian to think of a society which is completely non-violent. Okay, finally, we don't think that violence and democracy are different things. We have learned that in a democracy, there can be violence. What we have to understand is that violence is a beast which has to be kept outside society through the adoption of intelligent measures and sympathy and empathy. The beast must not be allowed to enter your society. The moment it enters your society, and by the beast, I don't mean something actually external. I mean something that is a part of you and which becomes objectified. And that is where a wise society really succeeds. But after saying that, I don't think I know of any society that is truly wise.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'm sorry, Sudha, I haven't answered your question, but I can't, after looking at all these acts of violence in different fields of India, I myself am in a state of great depression.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, to make it a society with the more of moral values and all that is very challenging, and probably it has to a very big revolution, and it has to be a process which should begin probably from a very young age, from the time a child is born and the way in which they are brought
Yes.
up.
Fortunately, there are counter voices. I remember when after Nirbhaya's rape case in 2012, when all these demonstrations were going on outside Parliament, India Gate, on the gates of India, on the lawns of India Gate, there were a lot of mischief makers who were saying capital punishment or castration for the rapists. But that is no answer. You're not going to get rid of the problem by doing this. What will they do? They'll kill the girl. That's what they're doing, no? So that they evade punishment. And there were a group of young people, very many of them were our students, who were taking out demonstrations saying, recover the streets, make Delhi safe for women. It's a completely different outlook, you see. You don't want castration, and this is not the answer to anything that is violent. You see, the answer to violence is not violence. The answer is to shift your ground. But I hope you young people can think of better ideas than my generation has, because we seem to have. And I'm stunned at this incident of child abuse and gender violence that we. Raymond Williams.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, we are unable to hear you.
I'm sorry?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you now. Okay, sorry, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for the insightful lecture. Anjana?
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. As we near the end of today's session, I call upon Badra from 2nd BA to deliver the vote of thanks.
Warm greetings to one and all. It gives me immense pleasure to propose a word of thanks today. First, I would like to thank God Almighty for showering His blessings upon us and making this event a success. Next, on behalf of the Association of Political Science, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Neera Chandhoke for enlightening us on Gandhi's critique of violence. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all our faculty members and students for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you guys virtually. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Let's hope the next time we meet, we can meet
Yes,
face to
definitely.
face. I've taken my vaccination shot, so I'm feeling quite happy about it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.